Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Light After Trauma podcast. I am your host, Alyssa Scolari, and I hope you all had a lovely holiday. I know we are really in the thick of the holiday season, and I also know it has been a while since we have had a guest on the show, and we are changing that up today. I appreciate Michelle's grace. She is going to be our guest today, Michele Benyo, and I appreciate her grace because I have had to reschedule our interview quite a few times due to some health issues that I have been having lately. And I'm just very grateful that she is here on the show today. We have a great episode lined up for you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who Michele is. So Michele Benyo is a mom of two. She's a certified grief recovery specialist, an early childhood parent coach, and the founder of Good Grief Parenting. After her 6-year-old son died of cancer, her 3-year-old daughter said, "Mommy, half of me is gone." This heartbreaking statement defined Michelle's life purpose. Her mission is twofold: to help parents through the unimaginable challenges of parenting while grieving the death of a child, and to help parents meet the unique needs of a child who has lost a sibling in the early childhood years. The desire of Michelle's heart is to see families live forward after loss toward a future bright with possibilities and even joy. So this is going to be, I take a deep breath, and I encourage you all to take a deep breath with me, because this is going to be a difficult, but hopefully very inspiring and supportive conversation. And I am just very grateful to have Michele here with us today. So without further ado, let us introduce our first guest that we have had in quite a while on the show. Hi, Michele.
Hi, Alyssa. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. And, again, thank you for your grace. It really means a lot to me. I know lots of the listeners are aware that I've had some health issues going on. So, I know, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, I've had to reschedule Michele quite a few times. So thank you. I'm so happy to have you here. And we're talking about a tough topic today. And to be perfectly transparent, I am a trauma therapist. So death, of course, is part of what I work with, but every therapist has certain things that they might not necessarily work with because it might be a little bit triggering. It might be too triggering for them. And for me, I cannot see people who have lost children because I have a hard time managing my own emotions around that. So this conversation is a very new one for me as well. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your story and learning, because in the learning, I'm hoping that it's going to help me to be able to help more people. So thank you for being here. And I guess the first question that I'll ask you is, can you just let us know a little bit about your story?
Yes, of course. And just to say that your reaction to child loss is so natural, of course. I mean, it's called the worst loss for a reason. Yeah. And when I experienced child loss, I didn't know what to do with it. My story was that I was an early childhood parent educator. I had the best job in the world. I got to go to work every day and be with families of young children. And I was myself a mom of 2 young children. My son was 4.5. My daughter was 15 months. And then he got cancer. He was diagnosed with cancer at that age. And I didn't know what to do with that. That's not normal, natural child development. And we had to go through a 2.5-year journey, and my families in my classes went through it with us. And my daughter, my son was an amazing teacher as well. He was a very tender-hearted boy. And I just thought, oh, this child can't go through this. but he really went through it very well, like a trooper. I mean, he fought it. And that was alarming to me sometimes because he was really aggressive at times. But the doctors and nurses said, no, we want them to have some fight. Those are the kids who make it. But my daughter was 15 months when her brother was diagnosed. They were very close. And when he died, she was 3.5. And she said to me, Mommy, half of me is gone. So as though, the journey was hard enough, but then realizing what this had done to her, my loss was devastating, but hers was more heartbreaking than mine, because here I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who is facing the rest of her life with half of her gone. And I knew that was a true statement because of what I know about early childhood development and just, the formation of identity and just the impact that this kind of emotional trauma can have on a child's development in those formative years. So I was desperate not to let her grow up broken, with half of her gone. And I thought, well, I'm in the right field. I know where the resources are, but I wasn't able to find any. And I should say this was 20 years ago. My son died in the year 2000. And my daughter's now 25. So I've brought, I raised her up, learned a lot of things. There were no resources then. And I did need to figure it out on my own. There are a few more resources now, but I still find that siblings and any one of your listeners who is a bereaved sibling, whatever age, knows how overlooked that demographic is when it comes to grief, and especially really young children. Not many of them articulate what my daughter did. And we don't want to upset kids. Like you say, when a child dies and when a child's exposed to loss, we want to stay away from it. We don't want to deal with it. So I had to figure it out. And now what I have learned over my 20 years of just getting my hands on everything I could is what I want to bring to families through good grief parenting, which is the work that I do with parents who are raising young children after losing a child.
And it's such yes, even before we began recording, I was going through and preparing and reading about, what you do. And I thought to myself, this is such an important niche of people who are almost unnoticed in their grief process. Mm-hmm. It is unheard of. And I think back to the training I've had, and we have never, ever shown any kind of spotlight on children who have lost siblings. And I mean specifically children, right? Early childhood.
Right.
And what that looks like. And, there is rarely ever a safe space for parents who lose a child, but still have one or multiple children to raise. Mm-hmm. What do we do? So, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm so thankful. And can you talk a little bit about how did you get to beginning this? Because this is where was that moment that you shifted from, okay, I need to not just, okay, I'm helping myself with this, but you know what? I need to do more. Where did that shift happen for you?
Honestly, Alyssa, that shift happened right away because I was an early childhood parent educator. It was what I do. And I really can, even though I had other careers, I was a high school teacher, I was a communications coordinator, other careers before I did this. I started doing early childhood parent ed when I had my son. And it was really where my heart was, making good things happen for children and the adults who love them and raise them. And that was in my heart kind of because of my own upbringing, feeling a little bit, misunderstood as a child and my parents weren't bad parents by any means, but I learned I wanted to parent differently. So I always had my eye on that piece. And here came something in my own life that was so huge that I didn't know anything about, even with my training. So I knew then that as I was going, I would need to, especially when I found nothing else out there, that I would need to do this. But as I said, that was 20 years ago, and I founded Good Grief Parenting only within the last 5 years, because my own grief and my own journey and my own focus on my daughter was so primary for me. I just wasn't able to really, I knew I wasn't able to step into other people's stories yet. And now I am. Now she's raised. And so it really was very early on that I recognized that whatever I was able to glean, I was going to need to share. So this has been in my mind and has been sharpened and adjusted and learned over the last 20 years.
Wow. Now, can you talk a little bit about what is it that we know? What's very important for adults and for parents to know about the way that younger children grieve in cases and tragedies like this?
Mm-hmm. I think I would address that by saying that where I start in working with families is looking at what we believe about grief and how we handle grief as a society. And the way we handle it as a society with adults is that it's, something to avoid, something that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to bother the griever. And with children, that is so easy to do because they don't usually look like they're grieving. So what we know about children, and a story that I have about my daughter that gives me, again, just conviction in this statement that even really young children grieve, which not that many years ago, we didn't really believe they did. My daughter, as I mentioned, was 15 months old when her brother went to the hospital for the very first time. He had to stay overnight. His dad went with him. We had been through, a couple of weeks of figuring out what was wrong with him and getting this devastating diagnosis. And that night I was home with her, and she was, as I said, 15 months old, was wailing. She started wailing and making just an inhuman sound. It was alarming to me. I was scared of how she sounded. She was wandering around the house, upstairs and down to the garage door and up to David's bed and just wandering. And as I would try to go to her and comfort her, she'd push me away and throw herself on the floor. She was distraught with every cell in her little body. And I wasn't a mess. I was pretty composed, but she had been in our home when this disruption was happening, and she had absorbed it. And she knew her brother and her dad were gone. And this was, she was grieving. She was grieving the loss of her security. And so that, coupled with what she was able to say to me 2.5 years later, made me just really, really understand how deeply young children grieve. And so, they don't show it. Even after she said, "Mommy, half of me is gone," if you looked at her, she didn't, you wouldn't see in her like you might see in me that she was grieving. And we tend not to talk to them because we don't want to upset them. But I knew enough by the time we went through this that she had been very involved with the whole journey, because we weren't going to leave her with neighbors and friends while the three of us were together. Not after that first night where she reacted the way she did.
Right.
So
course.
She was with us in the children's hospital. And so she was very exposed to it. And I just knew that we would talk about this, that we were open about it. And I had to sort of educate other adults around her that, Deanna will talk about her brother. We talk about her brother. You'll talk about her brother. So the other thing is recognizing that kids need and want to talk about what they've been through, whatever kind of trauma it is. They really need to be able to give it voice.
Yeah. And I think that that's very important to say that, children grieve so much differently. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just not in the way that adults would grieve, because typically for any type of loss, right? Even adults who experience loss, there are simply no words. There are no words that could ever exist that convey what grief feels like.
Yes.
And so as adults, we struggle to find the language. So you look at
Mm-hmm.
a young child who doesn't even have their full range of vocabulary. Their brains are barely developed, and
Right.
their grief is simply not going to come out in words. It's going to come out in other ways. Like you said, your daughter was throwing herself on the floor,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because grief and trauma is stored first and foremost in your body before
Yes.
you even have words.
Yes. And they will break, it will be in their play. That's why play therapy is so effective with children. And that's what we did with Deanna in the beginning. She was 3.5, and we found a play therapist for her so that she, that person could just listen to her and watch her play and talk to her about what she was playing, because she was playing about Bun Bun. Her nickname was Bunny. And she was, they play about the person who died, and they might play about a funeral or some kind of thing like that. And we can learn so much by just paying attention to what they're doing. And like you say, often their play might be very aggressive and physical, and their behavior may be what we mistake as misbehavior because they don't know how to get it out any other way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Absolutely. Now, talking about play therapy with good grief parenting, can you explain like the general approach in your good grief parenting? So as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you work with both the children who have lost a sibling as well as parents, or do you work with the parents to help them to help their children?
I work with the parents. I don't work with the children because parents are going to be with these kids for the rest of their lives, and these kids are going to have needs for the rest of their lives. I came across a quote early on in my building of good grief parenting, and it is so perfect to kind of explain what I do. And it's a quote by an author named Anne Royfey, who wrote a book after her husband died. And in it, she said, there are two parts to grief. The first part is loss, and the second part is the remaking of life. So when we have the support groups and the things that are there right after we've had the loss, Deanna went to support groups at the hospital, so did I. But then after our 8 weeks, the rest of her life is ahead of her. I, as a parent, understood, and probably more than a lot of parents, because I was in the field of early childhood development, that this was going to affect so much about her life for the rest of her life. And how did I parent her with that grief-informed approach to parenting? And there was no one out there doing that. So I really am the longer term look at raising these children, not just getting through the loss, because there are, play therapy helps with that. Other, the support groups and the art activities and the things that help kids process it help with that. But then what about the rest of their lives when they're encountering all kinds of secondary losses? They go to school and do their little stories on their family, and they're, Deanna's a sibling. I coined the term sibling by heart because she's a sibling, but her brother isn't alive. To look at her, she looks like an only. She's not an only. There's a big difference between a child who's born an only and a child who is an only because their sibling died. And so, so a lot of needs, a lot of behaviors that children are going to express. When a child experiences the loss of a sibling at a young age, they're going to reprocess that over and over again as they get older and have a better understanding of what that means to them and how that affected their life and changed their life and the void that's there. So I work with parents for the long haul. I consider myself, I am a certified grief specialist, and we start there because before the parent can help the child, they need to make sure their needs are being met and their grief is being held gently, because you can't help your child with grief if you can't help yourself with grief. So I start with that piece and get parents stabilized in recognizing, how some of the things we think about grief, like that we avoid it, we don't talk about it, we don't talk to kids, how to do those things differently and in more healthy ways. And then we move into just really, what does parenting look like?
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciate that you help, what I hear you saying is you help people when they are more or less emerging from the immediate crisis and the acute trauma, and I think that's very important, because that's when so many people and so many supports pull out. And, David Kessler, are you familiar with David Kessler?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The book, what was it? The 6th Stage of Grief, Finding Meaning. I believe he put out a book a few years ago. And I believe it's the 6th stage of grief. I've talked about it on the podcast. So the listeners, I'm sure you've heard me talk about this before. It is a phenomenal book. But one of the things that he talks about, and that I think so many people who come into my office who have had any kind of loss struggle with, is in the beginning, when a loss first happens, everybody gathers around. And everybody is there, and people are bringing food and people are checking in. And then typically after the memorial service or the funeral or whatever it is that whatever kind of service there may be, it dies off. And there's so many, that is when things get so difficult because of all of the, like you said, secondary losses.
Yes.
So that is where you come in to help support parents when they're sort of like, okay, now what? Now, how do I keep breathing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. That is just so difficult. And that is really, I think, where the difference about child loss is so apparent. I mean, that happens with any griever. Supports go away later. But when it's a child, it's like it's this triple taboo topic to talk about the fact that a child died. And so people just don't want to entertain it. They don't want to upset the family, the parents, and they don't want to think about it because they've got their own little kids, and they don't want to think about the possibility that they could experience that. I even remember that for myself. I had some friends who had serious things with their kids before my son was diagnosed. And I remember finding myself sort of thinking that, feeling bad for those families and thinking sort of statistically or whatever, that was probably the closest I was going to get to it, somehow thought that knowing these other families that were experiencing this meant that I wouldn't in some crazy way. And then there I was. So we really do have our relationships change so drastically with the people around us.
Yeah, they really do. They really do. Now, can you speak a little bit about the stages of grief? Because, and I know we were talking a little bit about this before we hit that record button, but for so many people out there, and I know that a lot of, quite a few listeners of the podcast are therapists, and a lot of us, when it comes to grief, we are taught what feels like a very simple formula, right? Grief, here are the 5 stages, Now, David Kessler there's a 6th stage, which is finding meaning. But tell me about your thoughts and your opinions on these stages of grief and how they are used and if they are accurate to what people truly feel.
I don't think they are accurate, and I don't think they're helpful because so many people lean on it. I remember when I lost my son, I knew nothing about grief, and I heard about, and I had friends, people who were not professional in any way, quoting these stages to me that I was now going to go through. And I didn't go through them. I didn't in any way, shape, or form. And I kept thinking, why aren't I angry? Why aren't I this? Why aren't I that? And I felt like I was doing grief wrong. And I kept looking for these things to happen to me. And I think the reason that there's so many articles out there and people out there who really misuse those stages. And I think that's the danger about them because, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross didn't design these as the stages of grief. She stated these stages as what a person goes through when they themselves have had a terminal diagnosis, which is very different because I think if I had been diagnosed myself, those stages would have been a bit more apparent, in me. And so, but I think so many people are not really trained in grief and they grab a hold of what they've heard and they want to offer something to the griever. So they offer this. And I have been just so appreciative to see that there are many other ways of viewing grief that are now available. I like to think about how William Worden talks about the different tasks that we have. And I love that we now talk about how significant continuing bonds are as opposed to, what Freud used to tell us, which is get over the relationship and move on. Right. And so I think, as because you work with people who go through trauma and you don't see, people don't go through it the same. They all go through it in their own way. And you need to really, as look at what they're experiencing and honor that and help people through it without them feeling like there's a particular way that they're supposed to do it. So so I stay away from the stages myself because I look at some of the other things that are going to be happening in the families that they're going to need to be dealing with. And the fact that since I look at sibling loss and early childhood sibling loss, that griever that I'm focused on, the sibling, is going to change in so many ways as they mature and develop cognitively and experientially. So, their grief is going to change drastically.
Yes, it will. I'm sure it's continuously changing.
Yes.
Always. Now, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly, because this is a fascinating little fact that I don't think many people know. Did you say that the 5 stages of grief were originally created in response to a terminal illness, to a person being diagnosed with a terminal illness?
Yes. Yeah, they were not the stages of grief. They were the stages that a person goes through who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So yeah, kind of a different take.
Okay. So if I learned that in grad school, I apologize to my professors, because that is so interesting how we have taken that and sort of just generalized it to all grief, all grief.
Yeah.
That is really, really fascinating. So with your approach, what would you say? Because I know sometimes you talk about the 4 keys to helping young children heal from grief. Can you share those with us?
Yes, I have a good grief parenting framework that is sort of 4 pillars. I call them heartbeats. But then I also just offer these 4 simple things that I think any adult who works with children, because so Michelle's telling us now that we're supposed to deal with this with our kids and we're supposed to talk to them. And, that feels scary, I think, to a lot of adults. And first of all, the first key is, as I said, take care of yourself and make sure that you're meeting your own needs. And that doesn't mean, just bubble baths and walks in the woods. It means figuring out what it is that you really need in the midst of this crisis that you're having and this devastating loss that you've experienced. And then making sure that you're speaking up for yourself and getting your needs met and taking time to do that and getting the support you need, even though you have young children. And that, parenting and grieving are the 2 toughest roles that adults and families have. And when you've got to do them at the same time, how do you do that?
Yeah.
So self-care has to come first. As important as your little person is, and they're relying on you totally. You need to take care of yourself first. And then the other key is recognizing that rather than shying away from the loss and kind of avoiding it and kind of not wanting to bring it up to upset anybody, that continuing bonds piece of, building the relationship and continuing it forward in new ways is so important for yourself and for your child, because that sibling bond doesn't end. I have met adults who lost a sibling as a young child whose parents never talked about that child again. And they grew up with this void and with this feeling that something was off that they could never quite deal with. And some of the research that I discovered, later as I continue to look at this really showed that people who kept that relationship, bereaved siblings, bereaved as children who kept that relationship, felt good about it, felt good that they had it, even though their sibling wasn't there. So that continuing bonds, finding ways to honor that child in your family or that loved one in your family is a healing thing. So when people tell you you shouldn't keep your child's things in the house or, get rid of their pictures or whatever, your gut feeling that, no, I want to keep these here is correct. You are the one that knows what's best for you. And so continuing bonds is a second key. And the third one is conversation, having conversations with your child around this loss and around other griefs as well. I share the story of when all of us experience grief in childhood first, and it's not always the death of a loved one. For me, the first grief that I remember was the loss of a floating toy. I was at the lake and he got away. Wally the walrus, my riding floating toy that was so fun, got away from me and he started to float off. And the adults who could swim tried to get him, but the wind took him out of reach. And I had to stand on the beach and watch him float. I watched him till he was a dot on the horizon. And I felt, to this day, and that was decades ago, to this day, I feel that feeling of, I've lost him. He's gone. I'm never going to get him back. And that's what grief is. And Mark Twain has a quote that says, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's in all matters of grief, a child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are losses of the same weight. So the fourth key then is to honor grief, to honor childhood grief so that kids can learn that grief is natural. Yes, it was just a toy, which is what many of us as adults would say, or, we can get a new one, or, the dog is hit by a car, we'll get a new puppy. Well, fine, but it won't be that puppy. Grief is something that we need to help children recognize as very real and normal and natural. And we experience it, we experience loss, and then this is how we live forward. And so those are the four keys. The first one is that self-care. The second one is maintain continuing bonds. The third one is to invite conversation. And the fourth one is to honor grief, even children's grief. If I lost Wally the walrus today, it wouldn't be a case for grief with me because I'm an adult, but it was for me as a child.
It was. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Incredible advice. Absolutely incredible. Thank you for that. And, I've learned so much, and I can only imagine that the listeners have learned so much too. Even phrases like siblings by heart and secondary loss, right? Mm-hmm. These are things that are not talked about a lot, but are so crucial and vital. Mm-hmm. And we've also talked a lot about the importance of communication, how it is so important to continue this conversation. Now, Is that what you would say is one of the biggest mistakes that parents or adults would make regarding, children and grief?
Yes, I would put it at the very top.
The very top.
That idea that we don't want to talk about it. That child is thinking, like my daughter when she was 15 months old, she was picking up the vibes. I mean, when they're around us and we're experiencing this, they pick up on it. They're very perceptive. They're watching us, they're listening to us, they're feeling us. And if we don't tell them what's happening, they are going to feel very insecure, very worried, very scared. They're going to see us being upset and they're going to wonder, is mom going to be able to take care of me? She's kind of, she's not herself. So talking to them is really the most important thing we can do. And we don't need to tell them everything. We just need to tell them enough so that they know what's going on. Of course, be age appropriate. And one of the things that is so counterintuitive for adults is that we really should use the word dead and died, because that's the only word that really tells the child what happened. If we use those other words, they don't quite know what that means. And
right. It's very confusing for children to say words or phrases like, your brother or sister gained their wings, or your brother and sister are in heaven. Like, it's very confusing for kids.
Yes. And it's true that young children, 3.5 younger, don't necessarily know what dead means, but they get the vocabulary word, just like they get all the other vocabulary words that we give them, and they grow into understanding it. And we can tell them, your brother died. He can't talk to you anymore. He can't feel, his body stopped working, and he can't do these things anymore. You can tell him that we bury him or whatever, or just that they're not going to see him again. And then let their questions guide the information that you give them. And that's why as they get older and they understand it more, then they're going to ask some of the questions they maybe didn't ask earlier. But they still know that what happened is this thing called dead. And so they never have any doubt that they're not going to see this person again.
Exactly.
And they're not afraid of that the way we are. Adults don't want to use those words. I had to learn to say my son died. I had to learn to be able to get that phrase out to anybody, let alone my daughter, because we don't want to describe it that way. But to my daughter, it's just a word. It's what happened. Kids don't shy away from that word the way adults do.
Right. Kids do not attach the same level of heaviness to or stigma or shame to so many words, right? That's something children learn as they grow into adults. We learn so much from children.
We do.
We really do. We really do. But that's a whole nother podcast.
That is.
Well, Michele, thank you so much for being here today. So if people would like to find you, where can people reach you?
They can reach me at my website, goodgriefparenting.com. Right at the top of that page, they can download a copy of my Good Grief Guide. So it's the Good Grief Guide on goodgriefparenting.com. And in the Good Grief Guide, I actually do provide more information about some of these ideas of grief that that are misleading for us and how we cope with it, as well as suggestions for actually how to talk to kids, because that's the other thing. Okay, you tell me to talk to my child. How exactly do I do that? So I would just ask all of your listeners to download this Good Grief Guide, whether or not you know anyone right now, any child right now who's grieving, so that you have it when you need it, or you have it to share with someone who may need it, and you don't have to go looking for how to do this. And hopefully you never will need it, but you may, and you may be able to support someone else. And then if you want to reach me personally, my website is the place to do that as well. So that's goodgriefparenting.com.
Yes, it's even a great resource to keep on hand for the therapist, for my therapist listeners. It's something I definitely will be keeping on hand for myself as well. And you all know the drill. The link is in the show notes, so go on over, check that out. Michele, thank you again for joining me and for being so vulnerable, sharing your story. This is a really hard thing to talk about, but
Yes.
I learned so much, and I appreciate the work that you're doing, because you are not alone in what you have gone through, and you are speaking so that others can feel supported. So
yes.
Thank you so much for everything that you are doing.
Thank you, Alyssa. I was very happy to have the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. For more information, please head over to lightaftertrauma.com, or you can also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at lightaftertrauma, and on Twitter, it is at lightafterpod. Lastly, please head over to patreon.com/lightaftertrauma to support our show. We are asking for $5 a month, which is the equivalent to a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So please head on over again. That's patreon.com/lightaftertrauma. Thank you, and we appreciate your support.